Good evening. I'm Julio Elizalde, Artistic Director of the Olympic Music Festival. And thank you for joining us tonight for our Behind the Notes educational discussion. Tonight's discussion is entitled Beethoven and Music in Our New World. Now, we'll get to the main topics a little bit later, but first, I want to say thank you to all of you that were able to join us on Sunday evening. We're looking forward to next weekend's concert, which is another Rewind 2019, featuring the music of Schumann and Brahms, both Robert and Clara Schumann. And I'll get to that in a little bit. First, before we get to the main topics of tonight's discussion, I want to take some of your questions. Thank you to those of you who were able to submit questions. You can always visit our website, olympicmusicfestival.org, and if you look below any one of the discussion titles, there's a little button where it says submit a question. And feel free to ask about whatever. We try to get to as many as we can, but here are a few that we selected for tonight. The first question comes from Kate Davis, and Kate says, how is the placement of the piano on the stage decided? Does the performing artist have a say? For chamber music performances, are the musicians and their instruments always arranged in the same order or position? If not, what decides who's where? Thank you. Well, Kate, thanks for your question. Piano placement is a very personal thing, I think, for every artist. With an instrument like I have here, with a giant 9-foot piano, a lot of the times it depends on the circumstance. If you're playing with an orchestra, it helps to have the keyboard slightly left of center. And when I say left of center, I mean if I'm in the audience facing the stage. That gives a chance for the conductor to be dead center on the stage. But also, one thing that is perhaps a little unusual to consider is the lid of the piano. Now, if you look at this image, you'll see the lid is actually a little left of center, so that more of the lid can act as a reflector for the sound. Now, if you put the reflector or the lid a little too far to the right, it can perhaps have not the greatest effect in a very large space. Now, in chamber music, I personally like to have the keyboard dead center. I think it gives an opportunity for, if I'm playing with a violinist or I'm playing with a trio, it gives people space, because if I decide to put the piano perhaps in the position I would if I was playing a concerto or a solo recital, then say if there's a violinist who likes to stand perhaps a little bit behind the keyboard, they're going to be really left of center. And I think that's not great for people who are, let's say, on the right side of the hall. So I kind of think about it in terms of both what is most visually appealing and what is going to do the best for the sonority and the sound of the piano. Often when I go to solo piano recitals, especially in large orchestra halls, they will most likely center the stick that holds up the lid, dead center. And that gives the greatest chance for the hammers. And the hammers on this piano are right here. They're not all the way at the keyboard, but they're deeper in. It gives it a chance so that those hammers are almost dead center, producing the sound in the center of the hall. Now, in terms of chamber music, I think it is a organically shifting discussion. When you look at old photos of string quartets in the past, especially early in the 20th century, string quartets have gone through this evolution where often cellists would sit on the outside, on the inside, second violin would sit on the inside, sometimes viola would sit on the inside. And I remember, maybe 15 years ago, it was very common to have the two violins together, a cellist and then a violist opposite of the first violinist. That's changed now. I feel like a lot of, especially young string quartets, are playing around with that, trying to see how that feels. I think a number of string quartets will tell you that they'll change it depending on the repertoire. Sometimes you need the inner voice of the viola to be right next to the first violin, gives them more contact. But maybe for something else, they're going to want to have the second violin next to the first violin, so there's more blending. It's a highly personal consideration. I think you have to just experiment. It's interesting for me in particular in terms of placement with chamber music with cellists. When I play recitals with cellists, I spent so much of my training as a chamber musician playing piano trios. And obviously the cello is going to be in the same position for a piano trio almost always, which is directly in front of the piano with the violinist flanking the pianist. When I work with cellists, sometimes there's a consideration in terms of whether the cello should be in front of the piano or behind the pianist. There are two kind of possibilities there. For me, I much prefer to have the cellist directly in front of the piano. I grew up playing piano trios very seriously. Actually, my first time at the Olympic Music Festival was with my trio, the new trio, and I got so accustomed to having the cello and the bass of the group right next to me. It seems to me a little more foreign if there's a cellist behind me. But on the other hand, when a cellist is behind you, there is a kind of a contact that they have where they can actually watch your hands. And there's perhaps a little bit more of a unified ensemble that way. But, it takes experimenting. I think the major issue I tend to have when I'm playing concerts is feeling close enough to the other person. Some people, I'm amazed, I'll watch certain concerts and you watch a pianist and a violinist, and the violinist is like in another zip code somehow. I think, being close together makes you listen. It makes you form a combined sound. And that's what I think we strive for. And so that's why we play quite a bit with these positions, just to find what's going to work best for the music. For our next question, it comes from Nan Toby Tyrell. And the question is, how do you learn discipline to focus on what needs to be practiced? During these challenging times, it seems to be most difficult to find 1 hour or a half hour to devote to piano practice. What are your secrets? Thank you for all your passion you bring to Beethoven. Well, thank you for your question. I think that, practicing, different people have a different relationship to practicing. I hate practicing. Some of you probably won't believe that, but I really don't like it. I find it frustrating, especially because practicing, yes, of course, it's an amazing day job to sit and work with this incredible art. But on the other hand, I think the better you are at practicing, the more you kind of learn to hate yourself. And that sounds a little silly, but in a way, what your role is when you're practicing is you are a conductor, you are a CEO, you are an editor, and you are constantly reviewing what you're doing while you're working. And in a way, the level of your artistry is dependent on the quality of what you're discarding. And I think that when you're working, you have to be relentless. And very often, I find a very deep connection to chefs. I mean, I like food and I like great restaurants, but I'm fascinated by great chefs and the kind of craftsmanship that they bring to their art. In particular, because they are recreating something over and over, So I find that when I'm watching them, they're very specific about what they want. They really are aware when something is just slightly off. And I think for being at least a pianist, that's very much what my life is about, is sitting there, spotting something, asking myself why it doesn't sound good, how could I do it better? I'll try 4 or 5 different ways of doing it. And then hopefully it kind of organically connects to what came before and after. And that's just, an ongoing issue. I think that the other thing is that as you grow older, and I think in a way it doesn't matter what age you are, but especially when you're returning to old pieces, you always have a different perspective. Maybe you have a little bit more knowledge to work with. And sometimes that starts driving the way you practice. And even today, I was working on a Mozart piano sonata that I'm playing on an upcoming concert. And I had a fingering written in, and I don't think I've played this piece in about 5 years. And I looked at that fingering, which I wrote into the score, and I thought it was insane. I thought, who would ever use that fingering? It was me 5 years ago. That's really the evolution of how you practice. And I think there is a joy that one can find in just working slowly, kind of facing yourself from the past, whether it be 5 years ago or yesterday, and just trying to grow beyond that. And I think that's really that's my secret, if there is one. Our last question for today is from Ellen Chu, and she writes, for the geeks among us, would you tell us a bit about the process of recording, editing, and airing these virtual salon concerts? Well, thanks for your question. This is kind of a wild undertaking, I have to say. And a lot of people don't realize it, but I am personally doing a lot of this. I'm filming, I'm recording, I am playing, I am editing, I am uploading, and then moving on to the next project. And it's, in a way, I think it's the reality of being a musician in the 21st century. You can't just be a pianist anymore. You have to be involved in many different facets of your career. And I think a lot of the young players are starting to realize that in terms of social media, trying to put themselves out there as much as they can. On the other hand, it's a very much a double-edged sword, because you can get so caught up in the brevity of social media that you forget to really command your craft in the way it's normally seen. And so that's a challenge. We can take a look at this video here. You can see the piano and how it's set up with a microphone, and you can see there's just lots of cables, a recorder, camera, light reflector. All of these things are working together to create this experience for you at home. And we wanted to really try to find a way to capture the quality of what we do musically and bring it to you however you're watching it, whether it's on your iPad, your computer, your television. We wanted to make sure that we were catching that in the highest fidelity, highest definition possible. And we're really lucky to have so much of this equipment. It's helping us to not only preserve the season last year, but also to create this, which is totally different. And I think the nice thing is that it shows us a way to be able to be in touch regardless of whether we're together in person. And I think that's the beauty of kind of the internet age we're living in right now. Obviously, all of us want to come back together, but I think that it's nice to be able to just do this and to be in touch regardless. So thanks for your questions. And for those of you who didn't have your question read, we're saving those, and some of those will appear in future discussions. And to those of you who are now curious to ask something else, don't forget to go to our website. This summer, these concerts were a real, fly by the seat of your pants kind of affair. To put these concerts together at the last second, I can let you know that it really, about a month ago, we weren't even sure if this was going to happen. But we were lucky. A lot of people did some just really incredible things to make this work. I'm so lucky that these artists were willing to travel, Stella Chen and Matthew Zalkind. And, some of you might be wondering how we're going about doing this. We're treating this kind of like we're going to isolate the three of us together. We all were tested in advance. I'm happy to report we're all negative, and we kind of made a commitment after that test was administered to just not really socialize, at least not without a mask, with both parties wearing masks to reduce the possibility of transmission. And then we are just taking all the precautions necessary so that we can be here together as a unit, and kind of isolate ourselves and just work. And that's kind of one really nice thing about it, is that we just get to work on the music. There's no driving, there's no traveling, there's no going into restaurants. We're just working on the music, and it's a very, very nourishing experience. The program in general for the summer is based around Beethoven. As I mentioned during the Rewind 2019 concert on Sunday, this was meant to be Beethoven's 250th birthday. And there was so much Beethoven programmed. And I think in some ways it's more relevant now that, now that everything has changed. The circumstances that we find ourselves in are very similar, I think, to the challenges and the emotional struggle that Beethoven captures in his music. And we're going to have a mixture of early, middle, and late period works scattered throughout the concerts. And I think that, his music never gets old. His music keeps always somehow creating more questions. The more questions you ask, the more questions you need to ask later. But his music is so human. His music is so just real. And there is this emotional depth that never you never find the end of it. And for us artists, and I think the same for the audience, it's a special experience to come together and just experience one of these works together. So we hope all of you at home are going to enjoy that together. The upcoming concert on Sunday at 5 p.m. Is called Secret Love, and it's a encore presentation of a concert we did in 2019 with violinist Andrew Wan, violist Yura Lee, cellist Matthew Zalkind, myself, and also my former teacher at Juilliard, Robert McDonald. This performance features music by Johannes Brahms and Robert and Clara Schumann. And just to kind of give you a background about why I created this program, Robert Schumann was one of the great composers and a prolific writer. His wife, Clara, was an extraordinary pianist who was considered one of the most formidable in the world. Actually, a little tidbit for you to know is that Clara Schumann, in many ways, is the person to blame, and I say that as kind of a joke, but as the person to blame for why pianists have to play from memory most of the time. She was one of the first who started to make that common. And so she started a trend, and it became standard for most pianists to play from memory. Before that, it was considered offensive, actually, to play from memory, because the highbrow critics thought, how could you possibly memorize all of the things that are in the score? And how dare you think that you are better than the composer to memorize all of these things? You should, pay homage to the text as if it's a holy book. So Clara Schumann, I think, in a way, paved this way for pianists to be a little bit more virtuosic and to just kind of let go of the score and just play. And then Johannes Brahms was, in a way, discovered by Robert Schumann. He was much younger. And, it's interesting. Murray Pariah, who's a pianist I really respect a lot, in an interview years and years ago, he was asked if there was any composer he could meet, who would he wish to meet? And Pariah, is famous for playing Beethoven and Mozart and Schubert and Bach. And it was surprising because I would have put money on thinking that he would have said, I would love to meet Mozart. But instead he said Brahms. And that came as a surprise. And so the interviewer asked him, why did you select Brahms? And he said, Brahms was the first composer who knew he was going to be famous. And it's true. Composers before Brahms were doing what they did without an awareness that they were creating some kind of legacy, that they were leaving something for the history books. And perhaps we're lucky that people like Bach and Beethoven and Mozart didn't know, because it didn't inhibit the way that their creativity worked. But the reason we know that about Brahms is because he burned so much of his music. He was, in a way, his most fierce editor. And there are pieces that are lost, like there's a second violin concerto that we know is gone. Theoretically, there's a cello concerto, which is also missing. And so many more pieces that he probably started, he felt that they were subpar, and he obliterated them because he was worried that it might tarnish his legacy as a composer. And in particular, I think he was aware that people were starting to compare him to Beethoven. So I think he wanted to leave the best possibility that his music would live on forever, and he succeeded. And so I think the Schumanns saw this greatness in Johannes Brahms. Now, there was a very dramatic change in their relationship because Robert Schumann, who we're pretty certain suffered from bipolar disorder, tried to commit suicide. And when he did that, he ended up in basically in a insane asylum. And Clara Schumann, who was taking care of a family, Johannes Brahms was there for her the entire time. And as they grew older, and after Robert Schumann died, they had an intensely close relationship. We don't know exactly what happened between them. There's no official, there's no way to know what happened between them. And I know one of my old teachers said that he was convinced that nothing happened between them because so much of the music that Johannes Brahms wrote that seemed to indicate some kind of affection for Clara Schumann. A teacher of mine said, if anything had actually occurred physically between them, it almost would have killed off that yearning and that inspiration. And there's one particular piece that I want to share with you today, in addition to the chatting, is Brahms' Opus 119, number 1. It's a late piano work. It's a very intense, quiet, passionate work. And the reason I want to share it in preparation for what's going to happen on Sunday is because Brahms wrote a letter to Clara Schumann, sending the piece and leaving a little note about it. So the note reads, "This little piece is exceptionally melancholic, and to be played very slowly is not an understatement. Every bar and every note must sound like a ritardando, or a slowdown, as if one wanted to suck melancholy out of each and every one," meaning every note, "lustily and with pleasure out of these very dissonances." I don't know about you, but I think you don't write to your friend like that. There's something very intimate about what he said to Clara Schumann there. And then at the same time, when you listen to the music, I think you'll hear what was really going on. Before we finish for the evening, I wanted to just speak briefly about a very important musician who passed away this week. And actually, I found out that he had passed away as I was watching the concert on Sunday. And this musician was a pianist, Leon Fleischer. He passed away at the age of 92. And Fleischer is a giant in the piano world. There's no other way to say that. He had kind of a meteoric rise, and unfortunately, he dealt with a hand problem. He suffered from focal dystonia in his right hand, and so he more developed at the high point of his career as a left-handed pianist. But beyond that, he was a conductor, and I think one of his greatest gifts that he gave to the music world was he was an extraordinary teacher. And Mr. Fleischer was kind of an unusual man. He had a voice, and I think my old piano teacher, Paul Hirsch, and I have to say, I think every piano teacher, every pianist that you would work with as a student knew Fleischer. He was just a fixture, and it seemed like he would never, ever leave. He was just always going to be there for eternity as a voice of, as an authority for music. And I remember Paul once said to me, we were talking about a Leon Fleischer masterclass because he gave masterclasses all the time. And I remember he just said, if you have a voice like Leon's, you can say anything and people will think you're brilliant. But more importantly, Leon Fleischer would say brilliant things all the time. And I think that as pianists, you would kind of sit back and be in awe of his lack of fear for the great music that we study all the time. In particular, Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms and Schubert. And I think about the way that Mr. Fleischer could distill everything down into a sensation, even. And maybe that's really what it was about Leon Fleischer, is that it felt like he was a medium who somehow could tap into the secrets about all of these great composers that somehow we just couldn't reach. And he would sometimes even in slightly enigmatic ways try to explain how the timing worked. And it was incredible how he had a way, in particular with rhythm, that he could smell from a mile away if your rhythm was not just right on the money. And I think every time you'd watch a class with Leon Fleischer, you learned a lot. You really just learned a lot. It would inspire you. You would go back and practice a lot, trying to find the sounds that he would find. And I will never forget, there was a time at Juilliard when I was a student, when he came and he did a very unusual masterclass where he did a class for orchestra, conductor, and piano, all three, on Beethoven's Emperor Concerto. And so there were 2 pianists, 2 conductors, 1 orchestra, and it was in a big orchestra hall at Juilliard. The audience was sold out. And he just would talk to the orchestra and clarify something, and you'd hear it immediately, that truth that he was getting. The pianists were both wonderful. They came really prepared, ready for him. And still, although they were, ready to play with the New York Philharmonic if they had to, Fleischer still showed what a chasm there was between this high-level performance that they had and this kind of impossible-to-reach perfection of the composition itself. And there was one moment when one of the students was playing the slow movement of the Emperor Concerto. And it's a wonderful, it's you almost feel entranced when you're listening to it. And the student was playing it really, really beautifully. I think it was hard to fault the attempt that was being made for the opening line, which is difficult in this piece. And Mr. Fleischer sat down, and when he would sit down, it meant that he had something really serious to say, because he could really communicate so well with his words. And he often would communicate also just with his left hand. He would sit to the right of the pianist and play at a very high register, and it would somehow sound like magic up at that very high register. And you'd kind of be trying to figure out how the hell he would do that. But he sat down and he played the opening of the slow movement of Emperor Concerto. And all he said was, it has to be energetic and still. And that's a kind of a strange thing when the music is so quiet and hushed and almost floating. And then he says, you know, when you cross your legs for a little too long and your foot starts to fall asleep, and you feel those pins and needles. And he said, you know, you're not moving your foot, but there's all this buzzing and this energy, but it's going nowhere. And he did that. And it was life-changing. So we lost someone important in the music world this week. And I think Mr. Fleischer was trying to find the truth, which he somehow knew. And in the process, he made us all a little bit better as artists. So I think all I can say is thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope this was helpful. I hope this went a little deeper into the music, a little bit into the background. And I hope you'll join us on Sunday at 5 for Secret Love, the music of Clara, Robert Schumann, and Johannes Brahms. And again, for next week's Behind the Notes discussion, I hope you will submit a question, and we'll try to include it during the chat. And also, please let us know your comments if something else would be more to your liking about what we talk about. But we're glad you could join us. And as always, thanks for being here for the Olympic Music Festival. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good night.